Hello everyone. So I'm going to talk about the origins of morality, the genealogy of morals. Originally I was going to do one long video talking about the origins of nihilism, but my phone can't record videos that are that long, so I need to break it up into two videos. So the first perspective I'll give on the origins of morality is something that Aristotle mentioned, and I can't remember what the exact quote was, but it went something like this. There were four different stages to the origins of morality. The first being the experience of catastrophe, witnessing a tragedy or catastrophe, a cataclysmic event. So this could be something shocking and appalling like the death of a child, for example. A child gets hit by a car. We'll give this as an example. And the immediate reaction which comes after this, the second step, is a form of schadenfreude. It's a form of a gleeful sort of joy at the misery of others, which makes sense given competition and human biology. It makes sense to think it's an ill wind that blows no good, and to feel pleasure in the catastrophe, because the feeling that is intuitively experienced when one experiences catastrophe, when one witnesses catastrophe, is a form of excitement. That's not to say that one consciously, rationally wants bad things to happen all the time. They want to see car crashes and people falling off buildings and stuff like that. But when it happens, the spectator is very excited. It excites the nerves of the witness. And then there comes a feeling of guilt, which is the third step. We become guilty at our own joy in misery and suffering, because we know, as conscious, rational organisms, we are not clockwork animals, that just as much as other people get their comeuppance one way or another, one day we'll get ours, and we can't justify rationally a feeling of joy in other people's misery, whilst knowing that we ourselves are no different, and one day we'll experience misery and hardship, and you can't justify one without the other. And so there comes a feeling of guilt, and finally morality itself appears as a form of compensation. We have to compensate for the guilt we experience at the joy we have at the cataclysmic event. And these are, say, the four steps in the origins of morality. Friedrich Nietzsche went into more detail and gave a more explanative origin on the genealogy of morals. And here it all stems from this idea of the weakness of will. So a strong will and a weak will, we'll start with a weak will. It's formed from the crashing and disharmonious clash of drives within a human being. So there are, say, the biological impulses, there are, duty that we have, to society, to, various bonds that we've made, to our own honor and whatnot. And then there's, of course, the rational desires, what we think is best, what we think we need to do. And in certain individuals who lack a sense of direction, who lack a clear goal, these drives, this multitude of drives, this plenitude, it creates a disharmony, an incongruency of drives and directions, which results in the lack of a clear goal. A strong will is to have a direct, clear goal, a sense of direction that one is pushing towards. And generally this is built around the idea of power, manifested in different ways, hence the will to power. But let's take the weak-willed individual. Because a weak-willed individual in every scenario will generally either react or deny. So they will strike back or they will run away, but they will never strike first and they will never run towards. This comes not just in conflicts physically, but also in social conflicts, and it comes with emotionality and romance and everything else that goes with it. And generally any reaction or denial that this weak-willed person or powerless person does is going to be harmful to the individual who's doing it. So, morality here manifests itself as a preventative measure against this reaction and denial, which is going to be harmful. So, give an example. Imagine a very weak person in a fist fight. So they get punched in the face, and they know that there's absolutely no way they can damage their opponent. Of course, in most scenarios, it is always best to punch back, because even a minimal amount of damage inflicted to your opponent will always amplify and affirm one's pride, no matter how badly they themselves get beaten. And I use the example of a fist fight because it's a very clear, obvious metaphor, but of course this comes in all forms of social interaction. But if, say, for example, they were so powerless that they were unable to do anything to their enemy, any reaction, whether it be fleeing and sacrificing one's pride, or whether it be fighting back and getting utterly annihilated, the morality here, the sense of taking a higher ground, or using sort of rationale and logic and reasoning to be passive and submissive, itself represents a relative power that, and I'll go into this in more detail in another video, how justice itself, how the concept of justice originates in a relative power between master and slave, which I'll talk about in another video. But here, not acting is a sign of a relative power in this regard. The morality is like a cushion or a shield, protecting the individual from himself, because he's only going to get annihilated, which is natural for the weak in Darwinian thinking, I guess. Animals, the weak animal gets eaten, he gets eviscerated, or else he starves to death if he's a predator. While the strong will glut themselves on the weak. And so, this is where the morality comes from. One can consider 4 different archetypes of what I'm talking about, of these moral measures, these moral archetypes in people. First, I'll give the example of the ascetic, and the ascetic is on the opposite side of the coin to the gregarian, which I'll get to in a moment. But the ascetic, what he avoids in his asceticism, is human interaction, human society, because in human society, the weak man is going to be at the bottom of the ladder. He's going to be on the bottom rung, and so to avoid this defeat at the hands of others, he becomes an ascetic. He ostracizes himself from the society, and thus he avoids human conflict. Much in the same way, the gregarian, the one who wants to commune in a sense, the one who wants to live in proximity to others as much as possible. He himself is the equivalent of a wolf who chooses to eat from the hand of humans and slowly domesticates himself into a dog. The well-fed dog who sniffs out animals for the human beings to hunt and in exchange gets some scraps has a relative power regarding the wolf who starves to death in the wilderness because he can't find food. Here we see the gregarian animal in man, who wishes to not go his own way and not struggle on his own terms, but rather commune and gregorate with others in order to subsist on a moral level. And thus he avoids conquering others, he avoids what is perceived as immorality. The third I'll give is the submissive. So much like the pacifist, the submissive, he avoids aggression, he avoids conflict, and he wants to live peacefully and equally with other people. The submissive man himself has a relative power in this regard. And again, the pacifist who avoids war and physical fighting himself is better off for it. And I do think it's a pretty degenerate type, and we see people like this all the time who avoid conflict of various kinds. But here we see morality being the antithesis to the will to power. Because in the way of a ruler or a king might oppress and exploit the weak for his own profit and gain. Those weak and exploited people who are being exploited, by being moral, they avoid being crushed completely. Because to rebel means to be punished, and to not rebel means to not be punished. And here we see morality almost as a manifestation of the will to power in the weak-willed. And to give more detail, I'd say the moral man invented his morality in order to justify a lot of the hardships and a lot of the cruelty in the world around him. And the whole idea of the world of truth and the pursuit of truthfulness, which was the basis upon which Christianity was built, the idea of a world of truth, a metaphysical truth, as opposed to a physical truth in the real world. I talked about that in my last video, about the pagan versus Christian attitudes. And I'll go into this in more detail in my next video when I talk about the origins of nihilism, and how nihilism itself was not the product of decadence, but how it was actually contained within the morality of Christian society already. And it was the impossibility of these morals after the death of God which resulted in nihilism. But I'll talk about that in another video. I just wanted to give this quick few points on the origins of moral thinking.